I'm going to talk for a few minutes about human nature. Uh, it's a notion, it's a concept that's been with us for a great deal of human history. And many thinkers have been trying to have provide some kind of articulated account of what human nature is supposed to refer to. What thing in the world does human nature applies to? The obvious candidate is it applies to human beings. We are human beings, and we believe, or some people believe, that we have a nature. Now, I think the issues, the questions around human nature are in themselves interesting, and I want to provide some kind of picture of what I take this conversation, this discussion, this domain to really be about. I myself, I'm not particularly attracted or motivated to say anything about what human nature comes to. In other words, I don't really want to give a definitional story of human nature, but I am interested in what it is that we seem to want from human nature. That question, what is it that we want from human nature, I think is very evocative. Now, what I want to do is sort of try some candidate options for assessing what we need from human nature, or at least what we seem to want from human nature. Um, I have a few minutes to talk, so I won't be doing a great deal of analysis, but I'll try and say something that hopefully you'll find beneficial. So, very generally, talk of human nature is supposed to have us bring to the mind's eye something like behaviors, and here I'm thinking about behaviors, right? Questions about human natures are fundamentally questions about human behavior. So, talk about human nature is really talk about behaviors in some way being in accord with nature. That very idea of being in accord with suggests that there is a human nature such that our behaviors can be in accord with it or not. And so we can sort of understand this sort of prism through which people are thinking and using the notion human behavior to be something like asking for the source of our behaviors. What is it that allows us to behave in the ways that we do? Now, from a religious perspective, one might have a story about our human beings being endowed with certain capacities by their creator, and thus their behaviors are in alignment with those capacities that they acquired. But typically, discussions about human nature, in my mind, are not really framed or explicated in the context of um, understanding religious tenets or principles. So the option then is to think about human nature and nature in particular from very generally a biological perspective, right? So there is the fact of us behaving in certain ways is a result of evolutionary forces having exerted themselves on us, certainly on our ancestors. And we human beings, we are inclined or likely to behave in certain ways because we have not escaped our evolutionary framing, our evolutionary cage, our evolutionary way of being, something like that. So I think that's sort of what's going on there. And of course, a violation of nature on this way of thinking about things would, in some sense, be a violation of what is proper to, appropriate for human beings as biological systems. Now, one reason I find the framing of what we want to be of particular use is because it allows us to think about biological evolution, to help us to theorize biological evolution. And then we really can sort of ask the question whether these wants that we have are consistent with the facts of biological evolution. So it obviously seems to be relevant to us that, for instance, if one behaves in a certain way, some people might say that that kind of a behavior is not consistent with human nature. So prototypical kind of wicked behavior is seen as in some way violating of human nature. But I'm really curious as to how we could find in nature the answers about whether or not we have violated nature's rules, nature's norms, right? So clearly, when we violate norms in the social sphere, or family members, or the institution, the social institutions will in some way act as a corrective. They will tell us the ways in which we have veered off the path that we ought to be on. From nature's perspective, in the most extreme cases, the way we get answers to about whether organisms have veered off the path, the natural path or the evolutionary path, is really to look at the ways in which some human beings or some organisms behave and the consequences that result. Clearly, if one is not alive, one is not a candidate to be reproductively successful, right? And on some view of thinking about evolution, or perhaps the view of looking at evolution, the only thing that we should be concerned about, really, or the most central thing we should be concerned about, really, is reproductive fitness. Reproductive fitness is achieved via the reproduction of offspring, and hopefully those offspring are remain viable, and in some sense so our genetic material gets laid down in our populations. Right? Violation of nature's or biological reproductive norms need not be a violation of, need not result rather in the organism ceasing to be, right? So we might think that non-paradigmatic way of reproducing, like using assisted reproductive measures, whether we're talking about human beings or non-human animals, are not in any obvious way consistent with nature. That's one view. But if we have reproduction, then that seems to be consistent with nature, because if nature is in the business of collecting more human beings or more organisms, then as long as you have more human beings or more organisms, then it seems like nature has achieved its success. So I'm rather curious about this notion that there could be violation. And so if we understand what nature requires of us, then we can behave in a way or in ways that ensure or prevent us from violating nature's norms. It is not at all clear if we don't have the very explicit violation with results in death. It's not clear whether a violation is going to be a violation for nature. And even if it's a violation for nature, how do we learn, how do we come to know that we violated nature's norms? It's not at all the case that whatever the source of nature is, whatever we mean by nature, whether we're talking about natural selection, whether we're talking about biological sources of life, it's not at all clear how we could get answers that we have violated the norms. But further, what are these norms such that violation of them is a problem? Nobody knows, apart from specifying certain kinds of very general principles, particularly when we're talking about reproductive success. Organisms are born, organisms move about, and organisms die. So the idea that human nature is somehow this essential concept that is of utility for a great deal of things that we need to do and that we do is not obvious to me. But I do recognize that there's been a lot of intellectual and emotional labor that has gone into trying to figure out precisely what it is. And I think all of these endeavors are in the service of hopefully making things better for us. Perhaps if we understand what nature wants, perhaps if we have nature's prescription, we can live better lives. Perhaps we can act in accord with nature's prescriptions. Um, Clearly, there are a lot of things that we do that just seems problematic to our living viable and productive lives. And yet we are capable of doing those things. So one might say that the fact that some things are problematic from the frameworks we're operating from don't obviously tell us anything about whether they are in accord with nature. And in fact, you might say being able to do those things means that they are in accord with nature. They're at least permitted by nature. Hence, we wouldn't be able to do them. So, my way of talking to my students about these matters is to really try and reassure them. I don't think we need to be so strung out about human nature. I think it is important that we understand what kinds of things we are. But the idea that there is a nature that is the grounding source of our behavior, and that if we come to understand that grounding source, we're apt to live better lives. It's not obvious to me. I hope you find you find this in some sense edifying. I hope I've said something that is useful. And if anyone wishes to contact me, I am at University of New Hampshire. I am Sabrina Smith. So I can be reached at sabrina.smith@unh.edu. Bye.